This is International Master Eric Kislik, and I'll be analyzing the only decisive game of round 2 in the candidates tournament in Berlin. It was a game between Alexander Grischuk and Wesley So. So let's get right into it. It went e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. So it started off as a Raya Lopez, bishop e5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castle, bishop e7. And here Grischuk played d3. This has been becoming more and more popular recently. The basic idea, as far as I'm concerned, is that white doesn't go for the usual plan of going c3, d4 in most Raya Lopez variations, because he kind of wants to put the ball in black's court and make him have to solve a difficult problem regarding his pawn structure. So you'll see that this is exactly what happened. Black played b5, defending the e5 pawn because bishop takes c6 was a threat. Bishop b3, d6. So now black's idea is to threaten to play knight a5. So white goes c3. Now his bishop can retreat to c2 if knight a5 is played. Castles. So white played h3. h3 is a slightly rare move, but it does have its purpose in the Raya Lopez, and very often white will play moves like knight bd2 and rook e1 and maneuver his knight to f1 and g3. It also cuts out bishop g4 in some cases. So a standard plan for black now would just be to go knight a5, bishop c2, and then c5. In the game, black opted for bishop b7, which seemed fine. And one plan for white, which is kind of interesting, is to play bishop c2, anticipating knight a5 in advance, although, let's say rook e1, rook e8. Now black has a standard plan from the Breyer variation of playing knight to b8, and the knight can come back to d7. And here black just has a very solid position. Basically, he's a full tempo up on a Breyer, so he's definitely equal here. So knight bd2 was played in the game, and here black played rook e8, which probably was not the best. Seems like he wasn't quite sure how he wanted to play the position, so he was sort of playing generally useful moves that didn't quite fit. So he played, here I would have just played knight a5 and then c5, and black just has a very solid position. He can play useful moves like h6 and rook e8 and probably just bring the knight back, knight c6. So in the game he played rook e8, white win knight g5, rook f8. Here I think the best move would have been to play bishop c2 now, anticipating knight a5, which can be met by b4. So he went knight to b8, and in this variation of knight b8 we can play rook e1. So in the game rook e1 was played, and now again black should have just played knight a5 and c5. So fundamentally, an important strategic point to mention here is that this position is completely closed and black needs a pawn break. He only has two possible breaks here. He can either he can either prepare c5, which might give him the option of c4, and just kind of prevents white from playing d4 easily, or he can play d5. He doesn't have that much else to do. In terms of playing f5, that would be very risky. He opted for d5, and you'll see why this ended up being a problem. So after d5, white took. White could have also played knight de4. I think this would have been quite a strong move as well. He went knight df3, queen d7, and I quite like what he did here. He basically concluded that if he takes on e5, probably that's going to be bad because there'll be the fork. So if knight takes e5, knight takes d5, rook takes e5, there's f6. So he went for d4, and he really wanted to open up the position because if white isn't fast here, black will just develop his pieces. For example, rook a d8, maybe throw in h6, and white probably won't have much. So he tried to open up the position quickly. He went d4, e takes d4, and here white made a slightly dubious but also very interesting choice of going c takes d4. What this did is it basically changed the character of the play. It took play into an isolated queen-pawn position. So now black needs to play a kind of a standard IQP, which is not frequently what people do with black and the Raya Lopez. So it seems like Wesley So was completely not taken out of book per se, although he was earlier in the game, but here seems like he's not really used to the character of the position. And actually what I would have played in this position is I would have played queen to d3, which gives white a nice option. At g6, white can go queen e4 with the idea of queen h4 with an attack against h7. The black king is very, very vulnerable there. And if he takes, white can just go bishop takes g5. He has the bishop pair and an attack and can simply play rook a d1 next move, improving his worst place piece. So, but he went c takes d4, black went h6, that's a useful move, knight e4. And here I think rook f8 is a good example of kind of a generic move that isn't actually that purposeful. So what I would have done is put immediate pressure against the d4 pawn. The important thing to realize here is that there are two fundamental ways to play against an isolated queen pawn, specifically a pawn on d4. You can blockade the pawn very, very firmly, or you can attack the pawn directly. And in this case, he would have been able to actually attack the pawn directly by playing rook a d8 and then playing knight to b6. For example, if a4, he can play knight b6. And I think this would have been a good way to play. Black can, for example, if knight c3, we can play bishop f6, directly attacking the pawn, and black would be equal there. So you'll see what happened in the game. After rook f8, white went bishop d2, so he's preparing to improve his worst place piece with rook c1. And here I think black's best would have been to play either knight to b6 or just to go rook a d8 and improve his worst place piece himself. What he did here was he went knight f6 and he wasted 2 full tempi. And what I mean by that is he moves the knight from d5 to f6 and then he takes on e4. So he wastes 2 full tempi and he improves white's rook. So this was basically a terrible waste of time in a very, very sharp position. So it's pretty easy to tell that this was a very bad plan by black. So white simply took, and now his rook is very active and can come to g4. So after bishop f6, which was black's plan, trying to trade rooks, white just got to play rook g4. He's threatening the h6 pawn. Probably black's best would have just been to play rook a d8, bishop takes h6, knight takes d4, take, and then queen to d2. But I think this position is winning for white after take, queen g5. And there's no way to prevent queen takes g7 without giving up the queen, and I think that position is winning for white. So, unfortunately, he didn't have much he could do here. So king h8, rook c5 was played, and Wesley So has almost nothing defending his king. Queen c1 is a threat, bishop takes h6 can be a threat, rook h5 is very likely to be a threat. Probably he should have played knight e7, but then we can just go queen c1 attacking h6. For example, take, knight f5, we could just go rook to d5. This leaves black in a very, very difficult position. For example, if queen c8, we can play take, and actually we even have time here. We can prepare to play queen f4. We can play king h2 and then queen f4. So this position will be completely losing for black. So in the actual game, he went rook a d8. And this was interesting because there was one trick. If the direct rook h5, then there's knight takes d4, rook e5. And even though black is down a piece here, we can't play knight f3 because a bishop takes f3. And the bishop on d2 will be hanging at the end. So in this case, we get to go queen c1 and bishop takes h6. But actually the position definitely requires quite a lot of play to actually be winning for white. So there's a lot to do here there's a lot of work left here. So white is a very good position. Black's king is quite exposed, but there's still all to play for here. So rook h5 wouldn't have been the best move. So he played queen c1, which was much stronger. And now knight takes d4 was played. So he basically gave up the piece. And the idea was that if bishop takes d4, there's bishop takes h6. So he played knight takes d4, rook e4. He basically just admitting that he wants to play down a piece. And unfortunately, this just doesn't really work. We go rook takes c7, queen takes d4, bishop e3, rook takes g4. And it's actually true that white could simply take the queen now with bishop takes d4, rook takes g2 check, king f1, bishop takes d4. Important point here is that if rook takes b7, there's rook takes f2 check. So we have to cover f2 with rook takes f7. And then we go queen c7, and this position, even though we actually give back the queen here with bishop e5 check, fortunately we're attacking the b7 bishop with our rook on f7, so we can just capture this way. So bishop takes d4 would have saved quite a bit of time, but in any case, if we look at the material here, black is, after rook takes b7, he's down a full piece. So he did get to capture the pawn here. White cannot take on b2 because of queen e1 check and queen h4 check with perpetual. So he just went queen f1. And he went queen f2, And so basically he can prepare to play exactly what he did in the game. So for example, if queen c3, he can play king h2. And after bishop e5, he just went f4, and then he played g5, which was very strong. Basically, there's not much black can really do here. He's down a piece. His king is exposed. So it should end quickly. Actually, what would have been a very nice finish after queen e4 would have just been to take on f6. He was probably afraid of a miscalculation in this variation, but after queen takes g7, he's just able to go bishop d4. So that would have been a nice way to finish it off. After queen f3, queen b1, queen f1, queen e4. Okay, so he repeated moves. He was careful to avoid a threefold repetition. He only repeated the same position twice. Queen b1, king f2 now, bishop b4. So black threatens mate in 1 with queen e1. So white just played queen e2. Repeated moves, and then he finally went king g3. Take, and he decided to be extra careful here. Played king h2, didn't allow any possible checks against his king. So after queen f5, he just went rook f7, attacking the queen, and now he finally captured. And after bishop d6 check, simply walked his king to h3, and Wesley So finally resigned. So very difficult start for Wesley So. 2 rounds, 2 losses. Going to be very, very hard to have a chance to bounce back. But very good play by Grischuk. He really put his opponent under pressure from start to finish, and the isolated queen pawn position that black had to play really was not easy to handle. So this was basically a strategic masterpiece for white in terms of handling the isolated queen pawn. So hopefully this was instructive, and there will be more useful content to come.